Hello, and welcome to another episode of MESS Industry Conversations. Today, we'll be chatting with Bryon Price, a mechanical engineer and the current Strategic Development Director for the AG Coombs Group. Bryon has experience in working in a wide array of energy and environmental projects. Now, let's get into chatting with him. Let's get started. First off, I was wondering if you could just give us a quick overview of who you are, what you do at AG Coombs, and I guess what responsibilities are attached to your role.
So my name is Bryon Price. I am a mechanical engineer, but my role at AG Coombs in the AG Coombs Group is the Strategic Development Director. So the AG Coombs Group is one of Australia's largest specialist building services contracting organisations. And so let me explain a little bit more about what that's all about. And so we're involved in the building and the property industries. And so we run end to end, as what we call it. And so we're involved right throughout the life cycle of buildings in Australia. So at one end, we consult and provide a whole range of advisory services. We're very much involved in the design and construction of buildings, and then we run into operation and maintenance and long-term management. So we see that building life cycle right from end to end, and it gives us some advantages and some real insights into how you design and then how you operate and what have you. When I say specialist building services consultancy, the bits that we're involved in are very much almost everything other than the structure of the building. So the air conditioning systems, the ventilation systems, lighting, power supply, the fire protection systems, the comms, pretty much all the technology in the building. That's what we make as our specialist focus. So that's the business I'm involved in. We're all over Australia. We probably look after a couple of thousand buildings. In terms of construction, the sorts of things that we get involved in at the big end of town are the big high-rise office buildings you see, a lot of the big office developments in places like Melbourne's Docklands or Sydney's Barangaroo, and then out into a whole range of other verticals. We're involved with defence projects. We're involved in a lot of data centres, a lot of healthcare developments, a lot of new hospitals. Even at Melbourne University, a lot of those leading edge buildings that you see, like Melbourne School of Design or Western Edge Biosciences, we've had some involvement in those sorts of things. And indeed, at Melbourne University, we actually looked after all the maintenance of the mechanical systems in all the buildings at Melbourne University. Just to answer your question a bit more fully, what does my role involve? Certainly doesn't involve any engineering as such. It's sometimes, I suppose, since I've practiced as what you'd think of as an engineer. But of course, the business is an engineering business. So the insights I bring to the business from an engineering perspective help me manage and drive the business. And I suppose my main role is around development, change, and the future. And so responsibilities around technology, engineering, business development, marketing, pretty much anything new and anything progressive. That's my challenge.
Let's get started with the questions. So we've asked a lot of engineering students what they'd like to hear from you. And as a result, we've had a few questions submitted, which I'll just go through now. So the first question was, what would you say are some key skills that would help a budding engineer succeed in the field?
I suppose the key skills, when you look at the list, there's quite a list I'll talk to. They are all, from my perspective, quite common sense, but it's just not a bad little list to listen to talk to. So the first one is very much around listening, and I'm sure this is the thing everybody gets taught as they grow up. You've got one mouth and two ears. Listen, ask lots of questions. There's any good organisation or any good people you're working for will very much understand there's no such thing as a dumb question. There's only dumb answers. So ask lots of questions. The other thing is very much, and this is implicit in a lot of engineers anyway, and it's part of the reason why a lot of us become engineers. Seek to understand, be curious. But in that, when you get put into a grad role, often you become very focused on what's in front of you and what you're being asked to do, and it's all very confusing and a bit challenging. But over time, seek to understand the business that you're working in. Ultimately, you're there to do a job, and you're there to be hopefully part of that business's success. So you really need to, as you become more comfortable in your role, look outwards. See how the business you're working in actually fits in the world. What context does it provide? If you understand the direction of the business, how it works, how decisions are made, and you then can align your thinking and understand where you think. And then if you perform, that's going to get you noticed. And so just understand all that. I suppose it's certainly not about you. It's about the business and what you bring to the business. The next thing I'd suggest would be you'll be thoughtful. And again, engineers typically are thoughtful people. They just don't blunder on. It is a very thoughtful, prescriptive, empirical profession. Some of the best advice that was offered to me as an undergrad was specifically from a design perspective. Have a reason for everything you do. You could paint something red or you could paint it blue, and it might not matter at all. But the fact that you've thought about it is a great discipline to get into. It means you will think about things and you won't make silly mistakes and say, "Oh, I didn't think about that. I just did this." I have a reason for what you do in a very basic sense. What does that also mean? It means that you're detail focused. That's a real issue that quite often we have with graduates. The detail is important. We're looking to grads to see the detail and get the detail right. That's part of the job. So the detail is really important. And people who are detail-minded, but still progressive, are really valued. And talking about value, I suppose that's another interesting little concept that we talk about a lot. Being of value to others, being a go-to person, being helpful. That sort of culture, bringing that to an organisation is really powerful, and it will get you noticed. And you'll become a go-to person. Really important. It's interesting how you get advice along the way. Some of the other advice that was offered to me as a very young engineer was stay off the critical path and don't be a cost center. Now again, that's really tough to do, and you don't always want to do that because some of the best work's done on the critical path, and some of the best work's done by cost centers. But it's not a bad way to think if you think about it that way. Another biggie for me is communication. I suppose I did my undergraduate degree at a time where engineering schools were just realizing that engineers they needed to be able to write, they needed to be able to stand up in front of people, and needed to be able to communicate. The world's full of unrequited great ideas, poorly communicated. So the ability to actually string a story together, be able to persuade, be able to inform, be able to stand up and present is just so super important. And for quite a lot of young people, that comes very naturally, and for others, it not so naturally. But it's a skill that all engineers need, no matter where you might work. The other focus as an undergrad, I suppose, or coming out as a grad is just understanding that concept of delivery. The big challenges that we have as employers of engineers is that we recognise that a grad's not going to come out and be productive day one, but the quicker you can become productive and a useful unit in the commercial enterprise, the better off everybody is. And so, the world of work's about performance and results. It's not about excuses. So there's a real pressure around all that. But there's also an understanding that it takes time to learn, and these things come with time. Ambition's an interesting thing. Working out what's required, then working out how to achieve it is something that's valued. Not somebody who looks to the barriers, but somebody who says, well, why don't we do this? And let's work out how to get there together. Often younger people, and I know I was often the same, you get held back by your perceptions of where the limits are. The limits are always a little bit further out than what you think they might be. You just got to keep moving forward and progressing. Long list. The last thing I'll talk to though, and this is probably the most important piece, is just people. And as engineers and as technical people, that's probably something that doesn't necessarily come first to people who are focused on the technical side of things. But great things are achieved by teams and the leaders of teams. By individuals, not so much. So people and your relationships are really strong determinants in your ability to progress in an organisation. If you seek to understand people, what motivates them, what doesn't motivate them, and how they can be worked with and led, that's probably the strongest piece of advice I have. Focus on the people.
Do you think that, I guess, the thing that's most lacking in graduate engineers these days is, I guess, their ability to work in teams with other people?
Look, it's really interesting, and it's a very hard thing to comment on because we're in an organisation which is really all about teams. It's all about people working together. It's very much that integrated process. And I suppose the reflection I have around the grads that we bring on board, and we've got some fantastic grads. In fact, they're all great. They're just all different. The ones that seem to progress and seem to move up the chain and be more greatly valued are the ones that are able to work with people, are able to take some initiative, are able to become go-to people, and contribute. But yeah, everybody's different. But yeah, very much that ability to work with people. As I said, great things are achieved by teams and leaders of teams. It's not the engineer sort of in the corner, sort of working away at calcs and bits and pieces.
The next question was, so I think from what I understand, a lot of what you do at AG Coombs is about energy efficiency in buildings and sustainability. Did you have a experience or a subject at university or something like that that sort of led you to that field, or did you sort of just fall into it as your career progressed?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I suppose a lot of what we do in buildings these days has got a real energy focus because energy, climate change, they're absolute massive topics. Climate change is it's the issue of the century. So in terms of what we do with all the services, as I say, energy is part of that. I wouldn't say it was a majority part or a big part, but it's certainly a real focus when you come to design and install and commission and then go on to manage the systems in buildings that actually use energy. From an energy efficiency perspective and my career, yeah, it was something that like a lot of things when you look back on your career, where you end up is often by accident or by chance. My career, I started in a very different area. I had a very eclectic start to my career and worked on a whole raft of different things. And I suppose my first significant job as a graduate engineer was in guided weapons as a control systems engineer, working for the Department of Defence. And that's a long way away from buildings and consulting and what have you. But got into consulting in my mid-20s because I had this really eclectic interest in just a whole raft of different things, and got into consulting, and then consulting led me into building services, and then an opportunity in the 90s to actually start a business unit within a large consultancy, which we then grew into the largest energy management consultancy in Australia in the 90s. And so that's how I got into energy management. In terms of the subjects that I did at university that helped me, I suppose in building services and engineering in buildings, I was very lucky to have a very practical undergraduate engineering degree. It was almost vocational in a way, which was great. So as part of engineering design, we did a lot of work with standards and codes and structural codes or walkways codes or even air conditioning, safety, structural design. One of the big challenges, and I'll talk to this in a moment around grad engineers, is there are lots of skills and lots of knowledge, but you don't know how the world works. You don't know how things get done. And standards and codes and those sorts of things are used by engineers to make sure we build things safely and efficiently and effectively. So that exposure as an undergrad to standards and codes and those sorts of guidelines, those industry guidelines, that was really useful later on. Now, as part of applied thermo, we actually did ductwork design, pipe design, heat exchangers. As part of fluids, we looked at pipework design and pump selection. Final year engineering practice project was around energy efficient aspects of plant design and the detailed aspects of that. And interestingly, as my final year project, it was around solar distillation. So it had a real energy thermo focus on it as well, a real focus around energy aspects. So the subjects were, interestingly, when I was challenged in my 20s with career changes, you go back to the books and see what you learnt and you reach out to people who you think might know. It was really quite useful. But I suppose the most useful thing that happened in my undergraduate years was very early on. It was either late in first year or early in second year. I actually got a engineering cadetship, and I was able to actually work in an engineering environment. And then I converted that into a drafting role, which meant, the company I was working for, I was able to be exposed to design, documentation, fabrication for manufacturing, a whole lot of machinated systems, worked on some really interesting projects. The lighting towers at the MCG were built by this company. So I designed all the welding jigs for those lighting towers way back when. So, I can look at that and say, well, I had a part in that as an undergrad. But it meant I worked in the real world as a 19-year-old, as a 20-year-old. And by the time I graduated, I was up and running. And so that was a really useful thing.
So do you think it's really important to sort of get your head in the real world as soon as possible, like just try and find any experience possible?
Absolutely, because to be qualified as an engineer, you need to have some practical experience, which I don't know whether it's changed recently, but it used to be around 12 weeks. But that's just a tick the box thing. The strongest piece of advice I can offer to an undergrad is to get out and try and find some sort of work in some sort of area that's aligned to what your study is. Get some sort of practical appreciation of the context into which your training is going to take you. Don't keep the job at Coles.
Yeah.
Don't keep the job at Bunnings. Go and try and find a job somewhere as an intern or something of that like. It's just such a powerful thing because I use the word again. It provides such context to your education, and as you'd reflect, given where you're at with your education, the first 2 or 3 years, it's just a whole bunch of Lego pieces that really come together until towards the end of your degree. And to be able to provide that context and relevance to the bits on the way through, it just helps you understand and learn. It also helps motivate you as well. Obviously pays the bills along the way too.
What would you say is the best way to go about finding this sort of experience? Like, do places like AG Coombs, should I just apply online to places like that, or should I seek out people and talk to them face to face?
No, look, there's no easy way, there's no easy pathway to employment, and the situation we're currently in, obviously with COVID-19, it's turned the world upside down as well. But putting that to one side, it really is about being tenacious. Actually, just looking out and looking at the world and getting a bit of a view about where you might like to work. The reflection I'd make is certainly my career's been, and a lot of people agree with this, that your career and where you end up and what you do along the way is more determined by the first job you get than by the actual education you have. It really does, and quite often that ends up being an issue of happenstance. But it doesn't necessarily need to be. There's no shortage of information. There's no shortage of opportunity to find out where engineers work and what they do, and have a bit of a think about what might suit you. Interestingly, as a cadet engineer, one of the things I was convinced was that I really never wanted to work in a factory, and that's where the cadetship was. It was in a large manufacturing plant that made all sorts of engineered containers, everything from underground fuel tanks and light towers all the way down to 20-litre oil drums, and there was a lot of machination and a lot of automation and what have you. It was fascinating, lots of things to learn, but I didn't want to work in a factory, so I never went there again. But I suppose organisations these days, certainly good organisations that employ engineers that are on a growth trajectory, we're taking on board a cohort of grads every year, but we're also taking on a cohort of undergrads, whether students are in an IBL program and they're taking a sandwich year, or whether they're working in some other sort of fashion. But we're really keen. Good organisations are always keen to get undergrads, because it's always a competition at graduation to get the best and the brightest. And if you can get these people involved in your organisation and passionate, and you can get a feel for their quality on the way through, that works for everybody. So I think you'd be surprised as an undergrad, once you start looking, how many good organisations actually do look for undergrads to come along and do some work experience and get involved.
The next question that we had, that a lot of people asked, was, I guess, us as engineering students, we have difficult homework assignments, we have challenging projects to work on, but these might not necessarily be the same challenges that we'll face in the workforce. And I guess a lot of us hoping to integrate into the engineering workforce one day might not be certain about what sort of challenges we'd face in the actual workplace. So I was wondering if you could tell us about a project you've been a part of, and I guess a challenge that you found during that project.
Yeah, look, I've got a couple of examples that actually highlight, I suppose, some of the issues of qualities and some of the attributes that are useful, I suppose. In terms of the challenges coming from day one, you do 4 or 5 years of effectively education and training. You've got some understanding of how the world works, but quite often every organisation and their business and how they go about their business is different. And that's one of the big gaps that a grad has, in terms of, well, I know how to do the calcs, perhaps, or at least I know some of the basic theory behind all that. There might be a whole lot of application. There's software, there's a whole bunch of stuff. There's all the peopleware, who's who in the zoo, who's the boss, who's the not. there's all sorts of moving parts to an organisation once you get into it. So there's lots of challenges there. There's quite often the challenges of working 40, 50, sometimes longer in a week as well, and all that goes with all of that. So there's all that sort of noise around that. But again, challenges are what makes us. I'm sure you'd reflect that, Luke, through your course, and you mentioned that in the question. Difficult projects, difficult lecturers, all those sorts of things. I suppose along the way, just some of the early things I worked on. I mentioned before that early in my career I was involved with Department of Defence and got a weapons design in my sort of early 20s. One of the things that interesting, another industry that I got involved in at the same time as a part-time exercise was the transport industry around semi-trailer design, and was lucky enough to actually come up with some ideas that I can still see driving around the road today and go, hey, I invented that, if you like. But the reason I invented that, and the reason I was pretty successful with some of the things I did with the guided weapons, was that I had a set of tools, but I had no preconceptions about how to use them. So that ability to think laterally and see the problem from multiple perspectives and then tease out a solution, and then I have preconceived ideas or barriers, that was really useful. And so that's something that a good employer of grads will value, your ability to think laterally and bring a fresh set of eyes to a problem, understand the issues, put a process in place, achieve the outcomes that are needed. That good design process. That's in the first instance, it's challenging. How the hell am I going to go about this? But again, you take a deep breath and you have a step back. One of the interesting things I find about reading about engineers that are notable and have achieved a great deal is how consistent their approach to the world is. Good engineers see problems and challenges as things to be solved, but more importantly, they see them as solvable, and so apply good process and step through it. We use called creative tenacity. There's always another move. There's always another move. And if you put that together, that makes a really powerful engineering paradigm. Problems are all solvable, and there's always another move. That's something that comes from having been through challenges. In my late 20s, I got involved at one stage around engineering project management. And one of the things we were doing at the time with the company I worked for was new manufacturing facilities, and got quite a lot of responsibility quite young around pulling the development of new manufacturing facilities, everything from finding sites and purchasing sites and the demographics around people and the whole plant piece and what have you. Just the importance of detail. You really need to work through people. You need to understand their strengths and capabilities, but you've got to be across the detail. So that was a really interesting thing, that concept of being across the detail, because if you're not, it'll come back and bite you. Around the same time, a little bit later, the business I was working with was involved in a lot of big hospital developments. And I got thrown in the deep end looking after all the engineering services as principal services engineer on a couple of very large hospital projects. And the other thing that came to me at that time by a director I was working for was, again, a lot of engineers tend to focus on that's what we're doing. I can see the problem over there. That's somebody else's problem. No, that's not in our scope, or that's not what we're doing. Whereas if you take a slight shift in your perception, you say, well, look, our client or the process or the project or the team has got a bigger issue. Perhaps I can help. Again, go back to that concept around value to others. All of a sudden, you might have a whole lot more work to do, but you might have a whole lot more opportunity as well, which often is the case in big teams where people do get very siloed and they get very contractual and don't see perhaps the opportunities. That opportunity to be helpful and collaborate and support and not walk past other people's problems and be helpful. That's another thing that, again, comes out of challenges and seeing challenges as somewhat differently to some others.
Lastly, you've had quite a long career, quite a successful one at that, like looking at your overview, a lot of like cool projects and like awards that you've received. But over this career, how have you seen, I guess, the need/want for energy efficiency grown, and where do you think it's sort of heading in the future?
Yeah, energy supply is it's one of the most, if not most, fundamental driver in our world. The economy, food production, health, transport, everything. Energy is at the heart of all of that. All you've got to do to really see that is just imagine what would happen if energy was free. what would it be if energy was free and if it didn't have an environmental impact? Think of how that would enable things. And so you get a sense of the importance of energy. The old 20th century paradigms around generation, distribution, usage, they're all being fundamentally disrupted. It's just a massive industry worldwide, and it's so full of opportunities for young engineers. Energy efficiency is only one aspect of that.
So do you think sort of gearing your career towards, I guess, the energy industry is probably a safe bet? Like that, it's just going to be, I guess, jobs all the time there?
Well, it's a really, really good question. It's a question that a lot of people at university think, well, gee, where am I going to focus? Where's a good opportunity to get a job and something that's going to give me some longevity of career? Certainly, that's, as I say, it's a massive global industry. There's so many opportunities in that. I suppose I come at it from a bit of a different direction. Get out and make a difference in the world, and certainly the energy industry is an area where you can do just that. Get out and make a difference in the world and be valued and provide value.
I think that's something really good to keep in the back of your mind. Just like find somewhere where you can make a difference, and then I guess the value will come from that difference that you can make. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to actually end this interview. So I just like to really thank you once again, Bryon, for sharing with us your experience and just taking the time out of your day to help us engineering students learn a bit more about what it means to be an engineer.
No, absolute pleasure, Luke. Really nice to meet you, and hopefully, yeah, it'll help people along the way. Thank you.